Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A huge thank you to everybody for coming out in such terrible heat. Thank you for coming to witness or to listen to our round table. I hope you won't be disappointed. So in this session, we're going to be talking about the value chain and whether it's been refragmented and how it's going to be put together again. I am Emmanuel Duté. I am the editorial director of a magazine called Usine Nouvelle. We're going to be talking about the ecological transition, AI, the value chain, many things. I'm going to hand the floor in the first instance to our moderator from the Cercle des Économistes. Her name is Céline Gimé, and she's going to give us a little introduction to the theme, as is the tradition, and then afterwards I'll be presenting to you the different panelists whom we will be fortunate enough to listen to today. But first of all, Céline, thank you very much, Emmanuel. Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to be talking about international or global value chains. What are these things? Well, we're talking about the fragmentation of production processes in different countries of the world to reduce production costs, thanks to comparing prices or winning new markets. So this usually transpires as delocalization. So these fragmented value chains have developed a lot with globalization and opening up to the exchanges of services, capital, merchandise, knowledge, technology. But recent crises, the financial crisis in 2008, the health crisis, and the increase in geopolitical tensions and protectionism, particularly in the States, are all showing their signs of vulnerability. And we're wondering if this is a sign that the world value chain is being reshaped. And what are the causes of these changes? So we've got some emerging countries such as India, Brazil, China. They used to be the workshops or the sweatshops of the world. In August, we saw international fragmentation of the political world, which made companies no longer decide to go into the geopolitically identified countries for semiconductors, IA, digital infrastructures, etc., stressing that unchaining of technology. And then we've got the ecological transition, which is motivating companies towards more frugal, shorter value chains. And then there's also the pursuance of tax advantages, mainly by the digital giants. So from one sector to another, from one product to another, things will vary. In industry, robotization has been able to produce targeted delocalization. Some countries are trying to double, or rather, to secure access to their inputs using double sourcing, i.e. they go and look for low-cost partners, but also partners who are geopolitically aligned to make sure that their value chain is resilient. On the other end of the scale, you've got services, which are continuing to be internationalized to a grand scale, driven by digital technologies. So what's going to happen on the international stage? Well, we are going to see a fall in flows between those blocs which are not geopolitically aligned, but we will see an increase of flows within these commercial blocs, for example, Europe or Asia. And we'll also see some big conglomerations which will become hubs of production, Bangalore, Shenzhen, and there'll be new emerging ones around Chinese, Indian or Brazilian technological groups or technical groups. So where does Europe stand in all of this, given all of these deep-set changes? Well, Europe is facing a double challenge. First of all, Europe has to reduce its dependency on third-party suppliers in critical sectors, but also has to rebuild a resilient industrial base, particularly to rise to the challenges of environmental and technological innovations. We've got the Green Deal, we've got European legislation for critical raw materials. However, this double ecological and digital transition require huge investments. 350 billion euros is the estimation by the European Central Bank. Inside Europe, countries are specializing, and that means that we will enhance the resilience of companies in order to create coherent industry. However, the European Union is part and parcel of international value chains, and we'll have to have partnerships in Asia or Latin America, let's say. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. We can give her a little bit of a round of applause, and that will create some breeze at the same time. That was a very rich introduction. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists. Next to Céline, we've got Hinda, who's Chief Executive Officer of Bureau Veritas. And then we've got Clarisse MAGNIN from McKinsey and Company. We've also got Markus Chen, who is co-founder and managing director of the China Macro Group. Ludovic Subran, Chief Investment Officer and Chief Economist at Alliance Trade. And next to me, we've got Professor Su, who is a Senior Fellow, Head of Department of International Trade at the Institute of World Economics and Politics and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. I'm going to start with Clarisse, if you wouldn't mind. Clarisse MAGNIN, you advise big industrialists. So what is this notion of the fragmentation of the value chain in your point of view, given the context? Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to start by saying that fragmentation starts with armed conflict. Well, in 2003, 183 armed conflicts were listed on planet Earth, and that has a huge impact on international trade. If you look at the Red Sea crisis, 30% of international exchanges were impacted, and that caused an increase in delivery costs. And then when you take a look at what's happening between countries, it's no longer geopolitics, this is armed conflict, and that has an impact on the value chain. If you look more precisely at the economic value chain, well, this is a gradual phenomenon. We're all quite sensitive to everything that Donald Trump is saying about the customs tariffs, but this trend began in 2017-18. He was president back at that time as well. It was Trump's first mandate. Then between 2017 and 2024, we saw an increase in American barriers to China. And they weren't only customs barrier, they were also hurdles for non-tariff international trade. So it was a 400% increase in government interventions in favor of certain sectors. And the United States, with the IRA and its CHIPS Act, that was the Biden administration, that wasn't Trump, well, they put in place this package of tax advantages to foster employment in the States, and that was very striking. I don't want to hog the mic because I know there are many people up here to take the microphone, but with this fragmentation, it's in all of the different blocs. The Americans are very clear. They are reducing exchanges with China. Since 2019 to 24, they were increasing their exports to 30%, but reducing their imports to 20% from China. So there's a big shift there. What did China do? Well, it redeployed, mainly towards the Southeast Asian region and the Middle East. And it gained 2% in imports from Europe. And my final point is the only region in the world that has remained stable in terms of international trade is Europe, because Europe has its maximum open rate, its 106% open rate, but it's the most open part of the world, more open than the States, more open than China, because we believe that it's good to compare and that countries, it is to the advantage of countries to compare different offers, and everyone else will benefit from that as well. Well, thank you very much. So let's move on to another point of view from Bureau Veritas, Hinda. What has changed most when you look at your clients, for example, your industrial clients? Well, thank you very much for the question. At Bureau Veritas, we inspect certifications and tests in laboratories for all kinds of things, products, projects, etc. We're completely impartial, independent, and we can act in the name of our clients to identify risks in terms of security, sustainability, quality, environment. So we are very close to the businesses we serve. We are present in ports, laboratories, offices, businesses in general. And so we have quite a privileged position to be able to understand what's going on. For the supply chain today, we are noting that there is very thoughtful, highly planned processes to redesign the supply chains, and this for several reasons. The first reason is to do with the positioning of a value chain in a multipole reflection process, i.e., thinking about the state of geopolitics in the world. Geopolitics has always existed. There's always been problems and conflicts. However, in reality, as Clarisse was saying, there have been these wars that have disrupted trade exchanges, but there increasingly are major long-term geopolitical stakes, which will determine how the supply chains will evolve. So in concrete terms, that means if you look at the rivalry between China and America, this rivalry is having an impact on supply chains for businesses, and the businesses are wondering how the relationship is going to evolve, and they are repositioning their supply chains in function of that. An example is linked to consumption. China today is responsible for many consumer goods that are produced. Furniture, household electrical equipment. So that's the first point. So countries today, businesses today are thinking about different hubs and how they can act to the dominance of China in certain segments. A second point in this multi-hub strategy is to do with non-tariff barriers, because these, in terms of the environment and ESG, will determine where the companies will base themselves. And also, there's that notion of strategic sovereignty. COVID was a wake-up call for many countries and for many businesses as well. They realized that they hadn't perhaps got a good strategy in place for their supply chain. So there we are, multiple hubs in the supply chain. And then not all supply chains are being reconfigured in the same way, because the business sectors are different. If there's a company that hasn't got very complex investments and can shift easily from China to Bangladesh, or can move from China to another country, or they can go to Central America, such as Mexico or Guatemala. We are lacking some infrastructures in the tech sector, for example, because you need more investment over several years in the long term. So you have to think very, very carefully about you're going to change things there. So that's the second parameter. The third parameter is this movement, which is the desire to have real proof on all subjects, that there is compliance, transparency, and to show that we are a responsible business. And that is key when reconfiguring a supply channel. We've talked about China. Let's turn towards Professor Su and see what kind of position you may have. China has for a long time remained the factory of the world, but now it seems that you are abandoning this role and you are being the designer of value chains, and that changes very much this notion. Professor Su.
Okay, thank you. And it's my pleasure to join this important event. My first point is that for China, I think it will still be the biggest factory, manufacturing factory in the world. And because, you know, China, although China's labor cost has risen in recent years, but it still has we call it comprehensive cost advantage, because, you know, we should consider not only labor cost but also for capital, for infrastructure, for business environment. So of course, the other countries, such the former speaker said, for Asian countries, for Mexico, for India, they will assume some part of their capacity of manufacturing future, and it happened, and I think it will be good for all countries, not only for the Asian countries, but also for China, because, you know, China has been complained for their such as for the capacity issues, and the second is yes, China is really upgrading during among their value chains, and I think we have seen it, such as China's intermediate goods. The ratio of intermediate goods in his total export has risen greatly in these recent years. And you can see some Chinese new energy products has a great, big competitiveness, such as for the EV, for the solar panels. And third point is that I think it still has a long road for China to upgrade, because, you know, China still has not so good competitiveness in some high-end, such as high-end chips. You know, the US doesn't want to sell high-end chips to China. So China still needs to do a lot to climb the value chains, to have advantage or competitiveness in some innovation or design parts. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Merci.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move on to Ludovic Subragno, an economist at the head of all investment for the Alliance company. You've got global vision of fragmentation and the value chain. So perhaps you can give us your feedback on what we've already heard so far. Well, it's all very clear. In 5 years, we've had 5 clashes with stock management or all that kind of stuff. 2001, there was the energy crisis in the Ukraine, China, and ESG. Now we've got Trump with currency, for example. We've got a supply chain crisis, and companies have to adapt. Of course, when there's more friction in the market, costs go up. There's a cost of diversification, the cost of bringing things back home. It's much cheaper to get to convey a single musician than to convey an entire orchestra. And we must take stock of what's happening with Trump, and the situation's not going to get better any day soon. We've got these import tariffs, which are at all record high. We've got these stupid announcements, 40% ending up at 20%, and they think the partner thinks they've come off really well, but it's 4 times as high as it used to be. So it's the funding of the supply chain is going to become a real issue, and that provokes me to say that countries and companies adapt well and fast. However, it's going to cost a lot of money. That's the bad news. since 2020, there have been such high shocks that companies are going to have to take a fresh look at their value chain. Look at crossing the Red Sea. When you've got a company that puts up its prices very heavily without anybody batting an eyelid, well, you know that's going to have an impact on the supply chain. And from an overnight, if you have tariffs on entrants, or you're in the car industry, and over 40 years you've been optimizing costs with wages, with supply chain, and you've really brought it down to bare tax. And now any inter-country friction will cost you 10 times more, 20 times more, not 0.2% more. And so there you're going to have to take a real fresh look at the way in which you broach production, export, tax, funding. And most of the big companies can do it. They've got the backbone to do so. They've got the cash. However, SMEs, it's going to be a catastrophe because they don't have that solid backbone to cope with all of these. So I really do want to have a generation of exporters. Otherwise, we're going to have heavy import costs. It's like diversification is very expensive, but it means that if you're not exporting anymore, you've got no more innovation, because export equals innovation. So we've been through 5 big clashes, and we may be discouraged, but we've really got to act. So that's not a very joyful outlook. Markus, let's talk about the return of Donald Trump to the White House with your point of view. How is China adapting its strategy to this new geopolitical landscape? And what are the priorities to protect industry in China and China's role in the worldwide supply chain, given this ever-changing story by Washington?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and great to see everyone. I want to use your question to build on what Ludovic has been explaining generally, maybe also from a European perspective, to explain it from a Chinese perspective. If you go back to 2016, you had the election of Trump 1.0, and you had Brexit. And this translated into a wording that the Chinese Communist Party created. It's called unseen changes unseen in a century. And this is a wording that you see mathematically consistent in every publication ever since, because you want to justify and talk about global value chains and how they are changing. From these 2 events, taking to the trade war, and then you go to the beginning of the pandemic in China in 2020. In April 2020, the concept of dual circulation was created in China, and dual circulation, I'll speak about it. It's in the view of the Chinese Communist Party, is the biggest shift in the strategy, as Emmanuel was asking, in the last 50 years. So everyone dealing with China, every company dealing with China, you need to understand what is dual circulation. I want to make a quick comparison, because dual circulation, in terms of strategy, it changed 3 things in China's development strategy. First, it put social policy on a higher level. China had less social policy until then, but it made it equally important to economic policy. Second is, China wants to turn towards domestic demand because it gives its resilience. And the third thing is, China anchored de-risking into its party constitution on the highest level. And a quick comparison to the EU published its economic security strategy in June 2023. So China was, if you want, 3.5 years ahead in diagnosing from Trump 1, Brexit, COVID, to fundamentally change its development strategy with these 3 things I was mentioning. With regards, that's my second point, with regards to your second question of how does China protect its position in the global value chains and in its industrial base, I would say there's 2 things, and they're extremely important for companies, for investors. China offensively and defensively, I just want to distinguish them. Offensively, China has recreated its industrial policy framework, and China has a lot of experience with industrial policy. It has defined emerging industries and future industries. And the future industries, there are 9. It's, for instance, humanoids, it's biomanufacturing, it's generative AI, and it is supporting with industrial policy to build these future industries. One important feature, especially in Europe, I want to stress is China's industrial policy, when it speaks about emerging industries and future industries, it deliberately does not want to support traditional industries. Whereas in Europe, I would argue, if you look at different sectors inside Europe, traditional industries have most lobbying influence. They have the best network and they get the best support from government, whereas the Chinese logic is to skew towards future industry. So I think that's the offensive part, and just let me close on the defensive part. China, as I was saying, in the dual circulation, it started to de-risk in the Chinese logic. It's not the exact same metaphor. To do this, China is trying to solve bottleneck issues. So where China has dependencies, it is trying to gain access to critical supplies. And it is, third thing, very important for a lot of international capital, it's driving onshoring with a lot of content requirements and onshoring requirements. So I would say, all in all, businesses are trapped, fully trapped into this shift in strategy, but of course it's taking place against the background where the EU and the US are also increasing their industrial policy. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, merci beaucoup aussi à vous, Markus. Alors on voit que la Chine se réadapte très rapidement et c'était très intéressant votre point, Clarisse. J'en reviens à vous peut-être, et ce qui fera le corollaire avec aussi ce que nous disait Ludovic sur les relocalisations ou qui sont revenus au cœur du débat.
Yes, Clarisse, let's get back to you from McKinsey and Company. In fact, what can we identify as the criteria which you have noted so that this history is all economically viable? Well, in the debate so far, we've been talking about the fragmentation of flow that impacts products, and services aren't impacted by everything we've just been talking about. So there are no customs barriers or those other constraints to international trade. However, if we talk about French companies, 75% of their turnover is generated abroad today, major companies. And that's very different to the American companies where 70% of their turnover is generated nationally at home. So these questions of relocalization is not the same thing when you're talking about services. Well, in the States, they are totally deindustrialized, really, practically the same as in France, admittedly. But when we take a look at the geographical distance, the average geographical distance, the number of kilometers that are traveled by products in international trade, that figure is very stable. So despite everything that we have said, France sends stuff out on 2,000 kilometers. For the States, it's 7,000, and for China, it's 6,500 kilometers. But when you see how those average distances have increased for transport of goods, then it's not really changing very much. So that isn't really an indication that relocation is up and running. It would, in fact, confirm the fact that this theory of comparative advantage is not dead and buried.
It was underlined by some of you two things. The geopolitical distance becomes very important. It's not so much nearshoring that we're talking about. It's I do trade and I work with friendly countries, countries that are aligned with me politically. And what changes the game is the countries that are not aligned or that are have remained neutral in face of this American and Chinese conflict. They're going to make more and more trade with the rest of the world. So all the Southeast Asia, starting with Vietnam, which is a country partnering with the United States, these countries have not chosen their sides, so they benefit from these changes of flows. And the country that is going to impress us a lot is India, because we can really see the increase of exchanges from India to the US, from India to Europe, from Europe to India, from Middle East to India, and vice versa. And it's between 2.5% and 8% of increase of the exchanges. So these are exchanges, but they're also relocations. And the relocations, when we are French, when we are European, we have to worry about the cost of labor, and the relocation is happening if those products have a very high added value for which the cost of labor is less impactful, has less of an impact, if it requires some very particular skills, if there's some legal constraints that make us want to work with companies that share the same regulatory framework, if there's some notions of innovation. And last point is if there's some made in France that contributes to the value proposition of the product. For spirituals, for example, luxury goods, textile, premium textile, but these remain limited trends. So we've heard since the beginning the word resilience being used, and this word has become a key word. What are the criteria, the concrete criteria that the big groups use, and even the less big ones, to qualify a supply chain that is resilient? The word resilience is a real theme in companies today. How we talk about this reconfiguration of the supply chain, some parameters are very important when we evaluate the resilience of the supply chain and the value chain as a whole. And at the heart of this idea of resilience, we have to think about a supply chain with suppliers at several levels that could resist the shocks, that can resist to all the risk, and that they may meet. So what does it mean concretely? First of all, there's a real issue around geopolitics. We mentioned a few times. So companies today, when they are planning and mapping out their supply chain, they think about those challenges. For China today, there's this famous strategy, China +1, which means that we keep some part of the production of the products in China, but we look for suppliers in other countries, China +2, China +3. And there's several approaches, but the idea is to diversify and to make sure that we're not submitted to the whims of only one country or only one production unit. So that's the first point. Second point is around the visibility of the supply chain. If you are a supplier, no, the retailer, you're going to buy a product anywhere in the world from a provider, but this provider is himself his own provider. So we're looking at several levels. What is required now by investors, consumers, employees, clients of a company is that they have a very good understanding of the supply chain. And we have to look at all the levels of suppliers, and we have to make sure that on the environmental side, social side, regulatory side, compliance, there's a real alignment. So we, as a company, we have to look at all these levels. Why do we do it? Because there's this whole movement around compliance, and we need to make sure that all these actors, at the end of the day, produce a good that we talked a lot about consumption goods, but it could also be an industrial product. They work along the rules that we, companies who are buying this product or order this product, estimate that is the right thing to do and the good practice to have. So there's a compliance that becomes very deep, that goes and gets all the aspects of the ESG framework, social, environment, and governance with all the suppliers. And last, what becomes very important as well for resilience is the digital side of things. It's to have a visibility on these supply chains. Digital visibility, we have the data, we have the actors that are connected, we have a whole ecosystem that is transparent, that can be checked out very quickly. And this is something that we see every day when we work in 140 countries. So we have to check on several suppliers for the clients to reassure them that they're well protected. Professor Su, I want to go back to you. You talked about the French shoring. What impact did the French shoring have and the fragmentation on the commercial flows and the investments in Asia from your point of view?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when we talk the reconstruction of the global supply chains, we usually said for the friendshoring, nearshoring, and reshoring. But I think for Trump, he just like reshoring because in his eyes, there's no friend. So there's no friendshoring in Trump's administration, I think. But yeah, for the because of the impact of the tariffs and the COVID-19, their companies are pursuing the diversification strategy. I think yeah, it's a trend. And so another is I have said that it's tariffs. So many companies, actually including Chinese company, are going abroad. Go overseas. You know, in China, we said a company go overseas or go to die. So go overseas is a trend for Chinese companies, and some multilateral companies are also pursuing diversification in the other countries. So for these countries, I think mainly are India, Mexico, Southeast countries. For Asian countries, mainly 4 countries. It's Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and for Thailand. And for these countries, I think they, of course, they still sell to U.S. market. But for these countries, they also import a lot of intermediate goods from China mainland. And so China, we can see that although China and U.S. has the direct linkage has decreased, but the indirect linkage are rising. That means the Vietnam and other Asian countries are just like intermediary countries. This is just like a bridge to China and the US. That means the US still needs China's goods. So that's one point. And of course, I think for this, it cannot be called free shoring because, you know, for Asian countries, they just have balanced policy. They are neutral. They just try to balance between China and the United States. So maybe they are not the friend of the US, so they cannot be called the friend shoring. And for Mexico, also, of course, it's near US, but Trump still imposed tariffs on the Mexico. So nearshoring is still, I think it's difficult under the Trump administration. So for nearshoring, maybe a trend in these recent 3 years. Yeah.
Ludovic, de nombreuses entreprises intègrent bien évidemment le risque.
Ludovic, many companies integrate the geopolitical risk when they decide to relocate their companies, and they have to be careful of that. Is it economically rational, or is it dictated by a pressure, political pressure? Well, I don't know if many companies do it because we're all we all believe in Nietzsche. We don't want to see the truth that hurts, that bites. Last year, Trump had already written it out. He was going to solve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, put up 30% tariffs, and we didn't want to see it. We thought he was pragmatic. We believed in Kamala, and then we thought, no, okay, he's going to be elected. He's going to be nice. So that shows how stupid we are. So the short answer to your question is no, because most of the boards of companies did that as a consensus. Who really wants to cut an arm, to cut a leg, to potentially lose a market? It's very difficult for a GM or president of a company to say, okay, there's a big risk that China invades Taiwan. Sorry, Professor Su, so I'm going to stop being depending on Taiwan. No, it's not the way it is, because Taiwan is a good business. So we're staying in situations like this. I'm going to stop doing DI because I'm going to lose the contracts with the American government. So we're in a very strange situation. The geopolitical risk, it's like sex for teenagers. We talk a lot about it, but we don't do a lot of it. So in my company, it's been a year that we talk about politics and Trump, and we protect ourselves a little bit against the dollar, but we didn't take strong choices because we're humans and we still want to have hope that things are going to get better. Now, of course, there's a war, so a war is a bit more scary, but even here, there was a conversation right before the session on the euro. If we're going to go to war, when do we accept to make the euro a strong currency? When are we going to go to war with the dollar? So there's some public choices and there's a corporate choices that for me show to me that people are not really taking into account the real geopolitical risk. And it's linked to human nature, it's a bias, it's a human bias. Is it just for European companies, or is it, if we look at the French boards, our boards are more and more global, so our boards are less and less French. So maybe it has a risk that is personal to them in his own chair, right? It's a good question because thank you, Emmanuel. Are Europeans more naive? Are we we're less naive than 5 or 10 years ago, for sure. To have internationals in the French board of French company makes decision more efficient on resilience. I don't know. I don't believe so. We can do a survey on it, but it's a story of cutting something now to be hurting tomorrow, and it's very hard to do for a company. Clarisse, to continue on this thought, this fragmentation that is accelerated. You said it before with India, but with the new regional powers, do you think we can take it a step further? Do you imagine that Africa can finally have a card to play, particularly South Africa? What do you think of the emergence of these new powers? I don't know if I'm going to be able to do a good punchline like Ludovic, but I'm going to try my best. What we see is, if we take a step back, is on the next 10 years, we're anticipated that 30% of the world exchanges will shift from one trade corridor to another one. We've redefined the commercial routes, the traditional routes. We've reshaped the planet in 50 trade corridors, and we try to project in each scenario how this is all going to play out. And we estimated about that one third could really shift. So that becomes, this fragmentation or this recomposition of flows becomes much more material in the next 10 years. And like Ludovic said, are we taking the right decisions or not? What comes out is the winners of this reconfiguration is the ASEAN, particularly Vietnam, Mexico, that becomes the first commercial partner of the US, and it's India. So there's the Middle East a bit, there's Brazil, there may be a bit of Africa, but in terms of volume, that's really what we're talking about. And the other element is we see an increase of the flows inside of the associations of Southeast Asia. And we see that a lot in the Southeast Asia. So there are many risks coming in the next few years, but also a lot of opportunities, particularly for Europeans, because we estimate that it was maybe one product out of two that is imported from China. That could be provided by Europe. It could be also provided by ASEAN. So there's a challenge of competitiveness here. And it's going to force companies to explore markets in which they can develop in a larger way. So I think that's something very interesting to look forward to. Markus, when you talk about this decoupling risk and the upscaling of all these new countries that take a bigger space, how does it viewed in Beijing? Is it viewed as a threat, or is it viewed as an incitation to say, oh, we're not afraid, we're going to win?
If I can just build on what Ludovic was saying, because what I see with companies, and I'm sure Clarisse also sees it in part of her business, I think many companies who are European companies, French companies that are working with the Chinese market, de-risking for them has become actually standard. So there, I just want to give you a couple of points that I think everyone is doing. So China Plus One, Hinda has already mentioned it, and then which I think is very important, is local financing. If you're in the Chinese market, you actually finance from within the Chinese system. So in case you have to get rid of the asset, you lose. It's the Chinese financial system that carries that. Then I see companies that create structure that they can get rid of their China operations if needed, and then also optimize, of course, supply chain. I think that's done everywhere. And then finally, because Ludovic was also mentioning it, of course, every company is monitoring the Taiwan issue, because that can shift the whole discussion entirely. Just briefly on the question that Emmanuel was asking, whether it's a threat or not, I would say the causality to unpack who's doing what. So from a Chinese perspective, the US is doing decoupling with a geopolitical logic. And Europe is doing de-risking, which is mostly diversification with less of a geopolitical logic. What would China want? China, of course, would prefer economic globalization just to continue. It would be easier. I think one interesting question is just, and that's just my final point on this, is where is Europe heading now? I hear very often European diplomats speaking in China about the openness of the European economy, but I just want to give you two examples, two recent examples. One is the bi-European discussion on a medical device, and the second one is the industrial automotive action plan that was published this year by the European Commission in March, that is encouraging investments that come into Europe, for instance, for NEVs from China, that European Union member states should make sure that there's tech transfer, or that there is local management, and so on. And I think, well, and that's just my summary point, I think everyone is mirroring each other, and this resilience that Emmanuel was mentioning, it's now baked in, it's now structural, and it is a negative vicious circle, yes. Thank you.
Yes, please feel free to applaud them. I'm going to come back to you, Hilda. Is economic sovereignty, does it bring us to the necessity to have regulations or standards? Do you see it as a war of standards between geopolitical blocs that could emerge? This is your work, isn't it? So what does the Veritas in the middle of that? So today we don't still have the war of standards, but it's important to understand how norms and standards are being developed. And norms, standards are being developed throughout in Western economies because they're going along with innovation, with industrialization, and the whole set of standards that are used everywhere in the world on various industries. And they're often the champions of certain sectors who want to, the standards become used everywhere in the world. What we see today is this an upscaling of certain economies, particularly China. So if we look at a sector where China is a leader, for example, in renewable energies, 60% of the windmill blades are made in China. Plus the graphite used for that is also made in China as well. So if we have a strong position on the market in a particular sector, we start developing standards. So standards are going to continue to be developed in the economies that I will call traditional economies, developed economies, Western traditional economies, but we're going to see the growth of standards in other economies of the world. What we see today as well, what is important, is the US are disengaging a little bit. There's a big movement of deregulation from the US that tries to simplify everything. But around risk, they're going to have to protect the user and the consumers and the companies themselves. And we see that Europe has a very holistic approach on all sectors that is, there's much more regulation and standards. So there's this fragmentation between those blocks. At Bureau Veritas, we are really a third independent, so we don't develop standards. But what we do is we make sure that all the companies that should comply to a certain standard or to be to comply to the norms are doing so. So we're trying to assess all their system, their products, their assets, and we try to reassure them that they are in fact complying to standards. So we're looking on how the system works, and we're in favor of simplification of standards to make sure that it doesn't become a blockage to innovation, and it still guarantees the protection of the user. Professor Su, I'd like to get back to you. Is the development of local chain or regional chain can lead to the growth of new hubs, industrial hubs, in the global south?
Yeah, of course, I think for Vietnam or other countries, even for South Africa, the countries all has chances to assume some capacities of the manufacturing. But if we think from a historical perspective, we can see that there are only a few countries can succeed in being a world factory, such as from the UK, from Germany, Japan. There are 4 dragons in East Asia, then China, mainland China. So it's not easy to be a world factory, I think. So we know that there's a fly geese theory but for labor industries, labor-intensive industries fly from one country to the other country. But in China mainland, maybe the goose will not fly away. But for Vietnam, I think they will assume some part of the capacity. But for HERRMANN, it's hard for me to forecast that there will be a HERRMANN in the recent 10 years or future 10 years. Okay, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Ludovic.
Thank you, Ludovic. I'm going to go back to you. I skipped a few questions so we could keep a good time because I really want us to go move on to energy transition. I'm turning to you, Ludovic. Do you believe that the energy transition becomes a new tariff barrier and maybe a new shock for the next years to come? I would like it to be, but unfortunately it's on the back burner now because we have to go to war now, and we forget that we were also supposed to go to war against climate change. So it's already a barrier for many companies in Europe, particularly with the carbon tax at the borders. It's a cost that is hard to hide to the consumers, and that creates a very unfair competition. The first intention being that we're to avoid the leaks of carbon, and we made it didn't affect the production in Europe. In the surveys that we do every year, we set the landscape of the world situation that in the credits, the tactic of adaptation of companies to standards and regulation and taxes around the climate issues is there, but it's not the priority, and they managed to go around it with technological tools. In fact, the climate is a huge catalyzer of fragmentation. Clarisse was talking about armed conflicts, but when the supply chain is disrupted is when there's climate hazards, floods, infrastructures, when there's shaking, earth shaking. The companies beyond the tariff barriers, and there's this issue of that the climate is disrupting roads and supply chain, and it's a question of cost. Are companies strong enough to live in a country where the supply chain can be destroyed one day for the next because of flooding, earthquakes, and all that? So this is not always taken into account. We're going to ask a last question to Markus. Markus, from a European point of view, the industrial Chinese strategy raises a few questions. How is Beijing addressing the concerns of overcapacity in Brussels? How do you comply to standards? We ask ourselves many questions on that. What are the major strategies that you could describe in a few words, please?
Very brief. So, overcapacity, the question that Emmanuel raises, I think is one of the most important questions. If you have a lunch with Ursula von der Leyen, it will be top of her mind. I would say two things. One is capitalism. In capitalism, overcapacity is somehow inbuilt, and any foreign business presence is a sign of overcapacity to some extent. On the Chinese side, I can just add that China has realized itself that it was over-subsidizing a lot of through local government, a lot of the creation of industries and new sectors. So it has changed last year in December through a policy by NDRC, the most influential ministry. It has de facto cut all local governments' possibility to use subsidies to attract investment, and this is a main lever to reduce overcapacity. Yeah.
Céline, À vous le mot de la fin.
Céline, you have the last word. Thank you. Clearly, we now see that we're not going towards a deglobalization, but rather at a reshaping of the world in a more quality and quantitative way. There's a question that comes out of our exchanges. It's the question of governance that requires more transparency in the value chains, more traceability, better tax policy. The state becomes a player that has to protect common goods and fund innovation. Energy transition has to be back at the center of the topics with the cooperation between North and South. And to conclude, I would say that before the value chains were based on logics of competitiveness, and today we're adding on that logics of resilience, equity, fairness, and sustainability. And we could all give you a big round of applause to our 6 speakers for having taken part in this round table. Thank you.